The problems facing New Zealand's primary sector have been mounting at a rapid pace. So I think it's time for open hearts and open minds. Welcome to Sarah's Country, your daily show where we go behind the headlines and we give you more on the matters that matter most to farming, food and fibre here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, our country's leadership on environmental matters feels like an awakening to one word: consequences. That many of us, we actually could see 3 years ago as this was debated going into the 2017 election. It's always been a very controversial debate, hasn't it, about who matters most. Is it the value of the human race versus the value of Mother Nature? Who does come first? Well, confirmational biasism, the ability to seek out information that confirms your already existing bias, has been alive and well for too long. Simple messages for us humans, that's what we need. It's too hard to wrap our noggins around, what cuts through. Let's try some. Tree equal good. Cow equal bad. Let's try this out in the comments below. What has been simplified so much, do you think, to the human race? Well beyond fact, let alone science. Oh, science, what's that? But the dangers of public opinion are being felt daily in New Zealand's food and fibre production sector, our farming sector. Our government is now making top-down regulation on freshwater quality and carbon emissions, not on traditional science, evidence, but bombardment of 90% of submissions from Greenpeace alone and regulating on that public opinion than fact. Have a read in Farmers Weekly. Neil Wallace did a very, very good editorial piece on this week. There's a quote I use a lot in my keynote speeches that I give. It is not my quote. It's a very old one from the 1700s. A nation that draws too broad a difference between its scholars and its warriors will have its thinking being done by cowards and its fighting being done by fools. I am very, very fearful of the world that we live in today, but you're here with Sarah's Country, where we talk about, of course, the matters that matter most and the depth behind those headlines. As stated on News Hub's two-part piece on the expansion of pine plantations being described as the biggest marketing con of our generation. But it solves a short-sighted box-ticking three-term government agenda. Point in, point out. I was thinking about this today, actually, this evening, as I popped out to the supermarket and stocked up on all those things. You know, when you buy a new house and you've got to go and get everything from scratch, from your Marmite to your laundry liquid, baking paper, cleaning products, cling wrap. And you know what? I am one of those self-proclaimed generations that have been greenwashed for decades. And, I fall for it, all of it, regardless of the science. But really, is it compostable? Let alone, am I actually going to really compost it? Joel, I don't know. Are you Gen X or Y or Z or what are you?
I don't know. It's all these alphabets at this stage.
But do you think about these things? You're a very vulnerable younger generation.
Vulnerable?
To these types of marketing cons. Do you consume, let alone vote, on these marketing messages?
Do I vote on the message? I mean, I vote, but not on the messages. Are
you one with critical thinking?
Yeah. No, I like to, if I see something in a shop, I like to think I'd do a wee bit of research on it before I go and buy it. But then at the same time, I'm also from a generation that's pretty broke. So, that plays into it a lot.
Yeah, see, this is the thing. And as a food and fibre production sector here in New Zealand, we have to actually appreciate the fact that this is what we're up against as well. Now, one thing we're not up against is an age barrier here on Sarah's Country. This is our audience. It's all about you. You know what? I've been absolutely stoked, especially when we're on holiday. We're getting a lot of feedback, not only through the old inbox. I had a lovely email from a 20-year-old shepherd in Southland who's just discovered our podcasts. But I know you watching live, 75 plus, I understand, who are very active commentators in the live show. So if you're joining us for the first time, thank you so much. We are Monday through Thursday live from 7 o'clock and on demand on podcast first thing in the morning. All talking those things about the matters that matter most. Now, coming up on Sarah's Country tonight, there is demand from our New Zealand farmers to plant out marginal land, but in native trees, which will restore biodiversity and protect waterways from that sediment runoff. But how are we possibly going to service a massive demand for natives coming from farmers and all these government projects? New Zealand Plant Producers Chief Executive Matt Dolan is going to join us after 7:20 to share this industry's recently hatched action plan that will provide that path. Then we're going to head to the Taranaki, where a painting has been created in support of farmers' mental health, and it's hoping to raise over $250,000 for the Rural Support Trust, and all in aim of reducing the stigma of depression. Taranaki artist Paul Rangiwahia is going to join us after 7:30. And to close the show, there is so much media debate we hear on our mainstream shows. Garner's talking about, Hosking's talking about it. Why is Auckland under mandatory water use restrictions for the first time in the quarter century when they should have got a water allocation 7 years ago? 7 years ago. Yet, an over-allocated Waikato River has not been acknowledged. We're going to discuss Minister David Parker's RMA reforms, which is very heavily putting the environment above all social requirements, with ECan Councillor Megan Hands, and what these reforms will mean for all regional council planning in the future. Now, I did say that Matt was going to be there after 7:20. He is going to join us, to kick off the show. After 7:20, Hawke's Bay drought has been broken. I was there in the weekend. I experienced that rain firsthand. It was very, very exciting. South Canterbury farmer Nicky Hislop has been one of the many feed coordinators that has been sending Canterbury feed north to Hawke's Bay. All that after 7:20. We're going to get Matthew Dolan on the phone from the New Zealand Plant Producers, but all after a few short messages. And I want to kick off. You may have seen it if you watched it with Sarah's Country, but I really want to make the point. Meet the Need has been a fantastic charity where you can simply donate one animal or more, which you will not know how much it goes to support our city missions and goes so far to feed our most vulnerable here in New Zealand. Please, if you haven't had the time to check it out, meettheneed.org. I really strongly suggest that New Zealand take this seriously. This charity has been absolutely fantastic, from Wayne Langford and Siobhan O'Malley. This is Sarah's Country.
Every morning, Kiwi farmers wake up to produce high-quality food. Yet, every night, some Kiwi families are going to sleep hungry. Meet the Need is a charity founded by farmers, and it's here to change all that. We're about New Zealand farmers feeding New Zealand families by donating a small part of what we grow when we can. You can help us make sure no one in New Zealand goes to sleep hungry again. Visit meettheneed.org and follow us on social.
Delicious. Ever wondered where it starts? Does it start with care? Respect. Fresh grass 365 days a year. The truth is, delicious doesn't start in a single moment or with a single ingredient. delicious starts here.
Well, it's all very well and good, isn't it? All these promised infrastructure projects and post-COVID-19 recovery in terms of biodiversity and planting of native trees across our country. But are we in a position to be able to deliver? Have we got the nurseries, the supply of native seedlings? We certainly do have the demand. We're joined now by Chief Executive of New Zealand Plant Producers, Matthew Dolan. Good evening, sir.
Yeah, good evening, Sarah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Now, hey, I mean, it's it's a bit of a good monster, isn't it, to have a lot of government funding flooding in to your sector. But have we really got the capability coming through? And what are those challenges to get to a point where we can supply that demand?
Yeah, well, it's not a bad problem to have, I guess, for a sector. To have this wall of demand ahead of it that we're seeing, and there's a lot of drivers to it. It's it's a transition towards more plants on farms and on land. Big infrastructure projects the government is investing in, and and environmental improvements on land right across the board, whether it be council land, whether it be farms, and in the environment in general. It's a lot of it seems to be pointing towards native plants suddenly. And so our sector's got a real challenge ahead of it to step up and meet that demand.
Yeah, let's start from the seed and work our way up. It's not that simple to harvest. Could you give us a bit of an understanding of what's involved to create a native nursery effectively overnight?
Yeah, well, it's not as easy as it might seem. It's certainly not a hobby, and it's not for the faint-hearted. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of skill involved in native plant production. And like starting with the seed, it's very, I guess it's difficult. It's one of the most difficult parts of native plant production is getting hold of the seed. A lot of these species, they set seed in different years. Sometimes they'll set no seed. Other times they'll have a mast, and you've got more seed than you can deal with. Different species have seed maturing at different times of year. And it's the skill of plant producers to get out and know what's going on and know where to collect seed at any one time, and be able to collect enough to produce the plants that they need.
And of course, in comparison to our pine plantations that grow at a rapid pace, these seedlings take a lot longer to grow to a mature fact for planting, and some of these very harsh conditions as well. I know a lot of native plants have been planted in areas that we haven't had that long heirloom heritage of knowledge to know what tree goes where in this country as well.
Yeah, well, they say it was quite easy to take the trees down. It's very, very hard to put them back again, and it's a massive challenge to know, what plants go where, what species thrive in different areas, and where you get the improvements with different species. So that, once again, it comes back to just that knowledge that as a country, as an industry, we need to really build and utilise.
How closely do you work with the forestry sector, Matthew? I was listening to an awesome interview on national radio, actually, of a group of researchers and scientists here at Lincoln University that wanted to work closely with them for, in particular, fire breaks. And here on the Port Hills in Lincoln, a massive issue. Is there a way of having a combination of both?
Oh, look, it's about getting the right plants and the right mix of plants in the right place for the right use. Native plants certainly have their role in ecology and environmental improvement, but they're part of land use, and how they're used is to their best advantage. That's where the expertise and the creativity comes into it. This is where we need the landscape architects, the botanists, the ecologists, and the farmers and landowners to get involved and start talking about how we use native plants and all sorts of plants in the environment and on the land.
I note here in this wonderful article that Richard Rennie has written here for Farmers Weekly about this, so you can check it out in your latest Farmers Weekly, is around that lost skill of nursery training. And I come from a mother who was horticulturally trained out of Otago Polytech in Cromwell, what, rather than money, is needed to be able to harness this horticultural education and training in your mind?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of people that want to work with plants. It's popular among young people, and it's really meaningful work. One of the challenges we have is that it's not a sector that's really had that investment in training and education over about 20 years, to be honest. And we're working pretty hard to try and re-establish some of those training programs and those qualifications. But it's also about that pipeline of bringing people into the industry and seeing that they have a viable career, and it's worth, building their skills and developing themselves in our industry.
Have you seen, in particular, a swing we've seen in mainstream media over the last couple of days with the highlight on News Hub of particularly Climate Change Minister James Shaw's biodiversity credits swinging even further in support of native trees over pine?
Oh, yeah, we don't see it as an either or. We kind of see it as an and. And native plants, I guess if you look at it from carbon point of view, they don't suck up as much carbon as radiata. They suck up about a third of the carbon, but they have other benefits in terms of ecology and water quality and other benefits, which at the moment don't have those hard metrics that you can refer to. And, you can start to make benefits towards native plants, but it's got to be based on science. It's got to be based on some proper metrics that can be used for the credibility of the projects.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matthew Dolan, for taking the time to join us. He's the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Plant Producers. Now, coming up on Ceres Country, we're going to head to South Canterbury to be joined by Nicky Hislop, a farmer there who's one of many groups in Canterbury that is supporting the feed run from Canterbury up to Hawke's Bay, which is very much about, what goes around comes around. And when Hawke's Bay looked after Canterbury back in the 92 snow. All that up next on Ceres Country. This is Ceres Country.
So here at Lincoln University, we teach various courses in food science, but also wine science and agriculture. And personally, I teach the course called the Principles of Malting and Brewing, also known as the beer class, and food innovation. So a class that teaches students how to develop new food products, going all the way from product concept to the formulation and the commercialization. This is the only paper in New Zealand that goes through a whole semester and teaches brewing. So this will give a huge opportunity to students to jump in this growing sector and being some of the few in the country that have the knowledge to actually work and be successful.
I really rate the quality degrees out of Lincoln for lots of good reasons. My one was very broad for a start, so it gave me a great broadness where I could go on and build from that. I think there is a lot of demand for science graduates from Lincoln in New Zealand. A lot of that is of course our agricultural background and our primary industries. A lot of it's from that, but not all from that. We have environment, for example, which is a really big issue in New Zealand at the moment. And we have great food industries. We have food that is really demanded all around the world, including beer and wine and that. And that's the really thing where those science graduates with the knowledge of those kind of industries are fantastic. What I really liked about it is you felt like you were going somewhere that was a little bit like a family, and I know that sounds a bit corny, but I always feel that Lincoln has always had that feel about it. It's a nice, compact campus. You're not all over town. You see the same people every day, and you really feel that that's part of your whānau out there in a way.
Students have plenty of opportunities to do practical work, whether it's group projects in the lab, but also individual projects. And these could be done at the university, but also in private companies.
Yeah, we've hired graduates here out of Lincoln, particularly over the summertime as summer students, and they're great because they always come with that practical aspect, which we really love. And I think employers love that because you can give a task and they can find a way to do it. And that makes them great graduates.
thank you lot for joining us live on your Tuesday night, for choosing us on your Tuesday. I can see quite a few eyeballs looking down and watching us wherever you're whether it's on your iPhone or on your big TV. Of course, you can put us, if you go to YouTube, Farmers Weekly, you can put us up there on your smart TV. Love to hear from you in the comments below, because this is an interactive show. You can ask questions to our guests throughout the show as well. I've got them right here on my laptop, so don't be shy. Now, we're talking about a lot of things tonight, but of course we're talking about the government's swing in terms of appreciation of consequences of a lot of these environmental policies. Certainly enjoyed listening there to Matthew Dolan from the New Zealand Plant Producers, and there is certainly a swing to the support of native trees being planted. They might sequester less, however, the biodiversity and ecology effect of them more. What do you think of the response? Do you feel that there has been a swing in this current coalition government in support of the way that their policy is now feeling those consequences? I'd love to hear from you throughout the show. Now, an appeal for Canterbury farmers to donate surplus feed has gathered overwhelming support, with over 2,000 bales of hay and silage heading for Hawke's Bay. That number was a few days ago, and I know it's been climbing every day since. It began when Ashburton dairy farmers Ben and Marianne Stock checked their winter supply and decided, you know what, we can help those Hawke's Bay farmers too. The couple initiated the Feed for Farmers Mid-Canterbury Feed Drive. You can check them out on Facebook. They had a bit of a ring round the neighbours and their friends, and it soon took off. One other farmer from South Canterbury who joins us now, Nicky Hislop, was also behind another drive. Now, Nicky, I know that you've got some dear family in the Hawke's Bay. How, horrible has it been sort of hearing firsthand from them around one of the worst droughts that the region's ever faced? Is Nicky frozen a little bit there, Joel? Yeah. She'll come back, I'm sure. Now, many of you will know Nicky Hislop from her roles with Irrigation New Zealand and, of course, a director on Beef and Lamb New Zealand. I think we've got Nicky back.
Yes, sorry about that, Sarah.
That's okay. I'm not sure if you heard my question, just about your family connections to the Hawke's Bay and hearing the devastating stories that they're going through.
Yes, look, it has been really tough up there. They've had such a long period of no rain. So certainly we've been chatting to them and, also reminded us about the fact that when we've been in challenging times down here in South Canterbury in farming, we've been recipients of feed sent down from Hawke's Bay. So really that prompted us to think, how can we help?
Now, Mary Ann and Ben Stock that we mentioned there in the intro, I know that you've been coordinating and collaborating with everybody who wants to get involved. How has that been in terms of constantly talking to each other about your efforts?
Yeah, look, it's been great. Really good to talk through the logistics of how we were going to get the feed to the North Island, and certainly Kiwi Rail's involvement in that has been really, really useful. So that's been great, and just really positive to see the support in this district, because there's not a lot of feed around. But I think everybody felt, look, if we just give a little, then that will build up, and it certainly has. But I'd also really like to do a shout out to our local transporters who have come on board, picked up feed from the farms and brought them into the yard, and also local contractors who have also lent a hand and re-wrapped a whole heap of bales so that we make sure that the quality of feed we're sending through is maintained.
And can we also give a shout out to the great team at Kiwi Rail as well, Nicky? They've been very supportive of this.
They sure have. It was really challenging when we started out to try and find an economic way of getting this feed to the Hawke's Bay. So it was a bit of a game changer when they came through and said, look, how can we help? So that was just fantastic. So that's made a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely, because understanding that all the will in the world is one thing, but the cost and logistics to get from somewhere like, especially South Canterbury to Hawke's Bay, must be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was going to be really challenging to do that by truck alone. So look, you know, to have those that feed rolling on up the rail track is just brilliant. So, you know, that'll head up to Hastings, into Rural Support Trust, and they're really capable team up there to get that out to farmers who are really looking for some extra help to get them through a tough winter ahead.
I'd love to ask you, there was a lot of criticism about the government's funding going specifically just into feed advice, telling farmers to suck eggs on feed that they didn't have and how to budget, zero equals zero. What's your thoughts on the government's response this time compared to other years dating back to things like 2013 and response mechanisms, and how we can have resilient response mechanisms moving forward?
Yeah, look, I still think there's some work to do on that. As you say, you know, there's only so much money you can spend on advice to do feed budgets. Feed budgets are incredibly important. But having done that and knowing that the picture looks pretty bleak, to have somebody else and double check that isn't the most constructive use of everybody's time. So I think we do need to think about that going forward so that we don't go through the same sort of challenges and frustration of having money available but making sure that it's spent in the right place.
And while I've got you there, Nicky, because I know you're capable of any questions, with your former hat on with Irrigation New Zealand, I'd love to know your thoughts on this particular coalition government swing over the last 3 years, especially over these drought conditions, to their appreciation for water storage.
Yeah, look, this is a topic close to my heart. Yeah, look, I do see a swing, and it is about the understanding of how important water is to whatever we do with our land. And in that particular, if we're going to move into more high-value crops like horticulture and so forth, that certainly you can do in parts like Hawke's Bay, then more than ever, those crops need irrigation. You know, they just need not necessarily heaps of water, but when they need it, they really need it. It needs to be reliable. So, you know, from my point of view, sensible water storage for New Zealand is so important. And, you know, it's not just about farming. We're seeing Auckland with all its challenges. You know, I think we need to continue a really sensible conversation about strategic water storage in New Zealand.
Nicky, as always, a pleasure to chat to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Serious Country. This is Nicky Hislop, farming there in South Canterbury with her many different hats on, but tonight a very compassionate friend and family member to those in Hawke's Bay. Now, I'm loving your comments coming through. I can see them. Brent Patterson, Butchie Butch, has said, nice work, Nicky Hislop. Thanks for your support from all of us in Hawke's Bay. We will not forget. You'll like that, Nicky. And Posey Moody over there in the beautiful Manawatu is cooking dinner and watching the show. Thanks, Pose. We need to catch up for a rosé very, very shortly. Next up on Serious Country, we're going to head across to the Taranaki. We were talking to artist Paul Rangiwahia, who has created the most beautiful, memorable art piece in support of the Rural Support Trust to keep us trucking on. That's all up next on Serious Country. This is Serious Country.
Billon has its own team of innovation specialists. It's our job to lead the way, working with some of the most cutting-edge science and research. We've got partnerships with some of the best suppliers in the world, so our farmers get the very best products for New Zealand farms.
And in every region across the country, the conditions are very different, and farmers and growers' needs are too.
That's why we're always looking for solutions that are just right, like here at our Huntly Service Centre.
And here in Canterbury, we've got a self-service silo, so I can pick up fat when it suits me.
And here in Morrinsville, we've got a world-class mill. That means that we can safely deliver our customers with the freshest, highest quality feed and minerals.
It's about putting the customer first, because that's what drives our business.
We've been focusing on faster turnaround of orders. We've got to get the right products to the right places at the right times.
Here in Taranaki, we've got New Zealand's only urea manufacturing plant. It's where we create our premium sustained fertiliser.
We're supplying nationwide and working locally. By getting to know you and what you want to achieve, we can help you get there.
And with the new My Balance platform, Balance has put my farm at my fingertips.
In fact, we offer support in all sorts of ways, sharing the best nutrition practice with farming families across the country. Whether we're talking about animal health, farm productivity,
or looking after our natural environment, sustainability underpins everything we do. We use our local expertise and the latest tools to help farmers and growers navigate the changing regulations, so you can leave your farm in great shape for the future.
And we can be really accurate, avoiding areas like wetlands and waterways with our award-winning Spread Smart tech. It makes the job far safer, more efficient, and gives you the best results.
When you've got access to that kind of know-how, you've got the support you need to make sure you're farming sustainably. It's that kind of thinking that'll keep us going for generations to come.
Together creating the best soil and feed on earth.
Oh, I love catching up with old mates in the comments. It's fantastic. Posey, yes. Rose, absolutely. I'd love a catch up, especially with all the Gizzy Bull sales this week. A huge best wishes to all of my stud bull family up the East Coast. It's fantastic to see last week a lot of those great sales prices and averages coming through, especially after a horrible time in the cattle game with COVID. So thank you. Now, Mark Warren, I apologise, I haven't called you back. Now, super big electronic hug from all the sheep and cattle in Play Bay. Nicky and your hay angels. What a lovely way of putting it. Thank you so much to Mark. Now, as we said there earlier, we're crossing over to the Taranaki, where there is a very, very special piece of artwork created by artist Paul Rangiwahia, who joins us now. Good evening, Paul. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you, Sarah. I'm really pleased to be on the show tonight and sharing this wonderful piece of art.
Joel, I believe that we may be able to put this up on screen for those of you watching live. Are we able to just show off a little bit of this? For those of you watching on an iPhone, it may be a little small. If you want to, please check out paulrangiwahia.com there and check out this as well. Now, Paul, I'd like to get a little bit about your background and your connection to rural New Zealand and why creating something of such significance was so important to you.
Yeah, well, I was brought up in Harwood, so a lot of my mates were farming stock, and so I went to school and played a lot of sport together, and I was always spending time on farms, whether it was dry stock or dairy, and it was just part of my life. We were a service town in Harwood, Kiwi dairies, and so for me, I've always been immersed in it. I've always been abreast with what is going on in our rural community, and as I've got older and grown up, I've sort of experience with my friends the highs and lows that they've gone through in terms of their own emotional and mental health. And for me, I'm a very proud rural person. So as I've seen the agricultural and the dairying sectors get a bit of a hard time, especially dairy in the media, it started to really strike a chord with me. And I'd had some massive success with a work that I did called A Mental Warrant of Fitness. And I knew that I could create something for the rural community to start, helping with all the pressure that they are under. Because to me, it seems there's a huge sort of divide between idealism and realism, and so I decided to create this piece of artwork to give a little bit back, but to help start some conversations around some really important things, about what's going on within ourselves.
It's fantastic. Titled The Top 6 Inches, and highlights 38 very clear messages for those of you facing long-term stress, and created as a collaboration with the Taranaki Rural Support Trust. You're not only an artist, Paul, you're also a speaker. When you talk about this mental warrant of fitness, how hard is it to jam that home to our very humble and proud rural New Zealanders about the appreciation of the significance of looking after number one?
Yeah, well, look, with the top 6 inches, for the title, we know that when our land is very productive. It's because the top 6 inches of topsoil is well looked after, and it's yielding plenty. But it's the same for our top 6 inches of our head. If we're in good shape, we're going to yield plenty, and we're going to contribute really positively. So for me, the key thing whenever I do work is to start conversations, because I think the hardest thing we find in New Zealand, whether it's rural New Zealand or any part of the country, is talking about those feelings. And so art's a great way just to soften the edges of mental health, which can sometimes be a really tough subject to broach. So with art, it's a great way to, as I said, to strike up those conversations. And if people can start to realise that these things that we're holding on to, and if we can get them out, we're in a lot better position to lead a lot more healthy and productive lives.
There's many of our audience, Paul, that will be listening to this as opposed to watching. Just reading through some of the 38 messages within this one art piece. Don't judge or compare yourself. Stop thinking negative thoughts about yourself. Respect will grow out of performance. Have quiet time. Guard your reputation. You only have one. Under promise and over deliver. There's quite a few different styles of messages here. When I first saw this art piece, I thought, what a fantastic thing to buy for every staff room and workroom around rural New Zealand, or even on the back of the toilet door.
I know. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's all about triggering, that change in our thinking, because sometimes we just get into a bad habit. And it's great when you look at the artwork. You can, I do what I call the scan, and I look over the artwork, and something will always jump out to me. And it's great because it just triggers me to say, okay, is that thinking, that negative thinking, doing me any good? Well, I know the answer is no. So I just have to find a way to, to change that thinking. And it's like one of the points on the top 6 inches is about the weather. The weather, we can all learn a lesson from it. It takes... it pays no attention to criticism. We can moan and groan about things, but sometimes it is what it is. So we have to find, what we have in our lives to be grateful for, because we can't control what the weather is doing at this point in time. Even though it might be the toughest, times of our life, we might be going through a 100-year drought or whatever it may be, we still have to try and find the positive things that are happening around us, because that's what gives us that little step forward to the next positive thing.
I was just having a quick look there, talking about on the back of the toilet door. Joel, you'll like this one. Covering a poo in hundreds and thousands will only alter its appearance. It still stinks.
Yes, well, that's from my original work, A Mental War on Fitness. But I've got another great one, which is on the new work, top 6 inches. And frustration and anger will pass. Regrets will linger like a smelly fart.
Oh.
So there is, yes.
And I
yes.
think
you like this one?
It's an interesting point you make there, because the owner of Farmers Weekly, one Dean Williamson, has a very big passion for poetry and believes that the Australians are absolutely leaving us for dead in rural Australia, that we don't have that here in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's quite true, actually. When you think about it, Australia, they love a good poem, and we love a good yarn, but in terms of poetry, it's something that's not huge, is it, in our rural culture?
No, and it's something that I think we should encourage together, Paul, moving forward onto this. Now, Paul, your connection with the great team at Taranaki Rural Support Trust, we know them very well personally as a family, and the great work on Marcia that we worked with Ali's Will to Live tour when we stopped through in Toko Hall. And specifically, it's your backyard. What are you able to do with the sales of that directly going to have an effect to empower that Rural Support Trust to make a difference in your home region?
Yeah, so look, I approached Mike Green, who's on the Rural Support Board, and I said to Mike, look, I've got a great formula that I think would work, and it's a great way to create awareness, but also to put some money back in the coffers. So he thought it was a great idea, and originally we thought, well, let's just push it through Taranaki, but it's got such a wide reach, so it's going out through all the trusts. So this artwork, whenever it's purchased through any of the trusts in New Zealand, that money will also go to that area. So if someone buys it in Otago or Canterbury or the Waikato, wherever that region, that money will go there as well. So it's I think a great thing when everyone's winning, like whoever purchases the work will have these really amazing enduring messages, and obviously money will go back into help supporting the trust. And we want to sell over the next couple of years 2,000 artworks, which would bring about $250,000 into the Rural Support Trust. So that's the goal, and we think we can do it.
What's the best way for people who are listening or watching to be able to check it out and purchase, Paul?
It's just to go to the Rural Support, their local rural support, to call the 0800 number, and they will just walk you through how to purchase it. So it's a really simple process, and it's a nice way to touch back in with the Rural Support Office in your region.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Taranaki artist Paul Rangiwahia there with his fantastic artwork, all in support of rural mental health. I'd like you to go to paulrangiwahia.com as well and check that out. Now, to close the show after this break, we're going to be catching up with ECan Councillor Megan Hands. We've heard all of the banter across our mainstream media, whether it's from Duncan Garner or Mike Hosking. The beat up is about what is affecting their backyard. I've always said this. Until it affects them, they will care. Water and water quality, water volume. These things were an issue 3 years ago when I was working and living and breathing on the News Hub floor in the middle of Auckland. And it was persisting with rain, 1,200 millimetres a year. And they were so disconnected to the vulnerability of their own water supply. Now, it's different. Yet the fundamental environmental impacts of their intake has now caught up with them. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Megan Hands, who has a real handle on Minister David Parker's RMA Reform. There's more into this pudding, and I think you should stick around and listen to this. Up next on Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country. I'm loving the comments below as we recall all of the help that's happened decades ago from our farmers around the country supporting the regions that needed it most. Jock Innes has said he recalls the snowfalls and droughts, floods in South Canterbury. The hay and all volunteer helpers, helicopters came from everywhere, particularly from Haast, and really appreciated the situation. It was a wee bit before my time, but I heard of the days of the DC3 pushing out hay bales onto those snow-covered mountains, the snow raking of the sheep up in the mountains. We certainly do know how to look after each other in this country. We are a very small backyard when it comes to it. Now, as I said there earlier, we have seen a lot of mainstream coverage around Auckland's dire drought situations. We are certainly not making light of that situation. However, here on Sarah's Country, it's about the depth behind the headlines, the reality of the flow-on environmental consequences of our impact as a human society. And when things get to breaking point is when we start to pay attention. Joining us now on Sarah's Country is ECan Councillor Megan Hands. Good evening, Megan.
Hi, Sarah. How are you today?
Good. Now, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you're very close to the wire when it comes to following the Resource Management Act reforms of Minister David Parker. Could you give us a little bit of an understanding of the current RMA and why it needs changed, but where it goes a little bit too far with David's intentions?
Yeah, so basically what's been proposed is that there's quite significant RMA changes that are proposed, and we haven't really seen too much coverage of that because it's been quite focused on action for healthy waterways. But this morning, thinking about the Auckland water story and thinking about the cries for help that Auckland's putting out there and saying, look, we need this water from this over-allocated catchment we're a municipal supplier, we should have some. It really puts into perspective some of what David Parker is doing. So the current RMA is based on a sustainable management framework, and what that says is essentially it's about providing for the needs of the community, for social needs, community needs, recreation, cultural needs, and health and safety. Now, David Parker's got 2 lots of RMA reform in play at the moment that came out of the Issues and Options paper last year. But essentially what is proposed in the Issues and Options paper is the potential looking at having a priority within the Act where the environment comes first, then people, and then everything all else after that. So instead of having a balancing act around sustainable management, we're looking at a formalised priority scheme. Now, that's a fundamental shift in the way that our resource management allocation scheme works in New Zealand. And I've been really concerned that we haven't been having that conversation. Is that the path that we want to go down? Rightly or wrongly, there will be people on different sides of the fence, but we're not even having the conversation. And I think the Auckland water story is one that's a good case study for us to think about. Does the environment always come first, or is there a balancing act in play here?
Let's talk about the over-allocation of the Waikato River and the fact that there's the 7-year consent that has been discussed for so long, or the application for consent for take by Watercare in Auckland. How bad is the situation with, the placement of these allocations and the understanding? Because there's becoming quite the blow-up between councils. This is obviously not in Auckland's backyard.
Yeah, so I'm not fully across the details of the actual consent application itself, but what I do know is what the team from the Waikato Regional Council has said is essentially the water is over-allocated. Auckland, like many other people, have got a consent application in. The way that our current resource management system works is that it's on a first-in, first-served basis. So if any of that water was to be clawed back and there was available allocation to come in, then the next person in line could apply for that water. Now, the situation is that Auckland's quite far down the list. I think we heard this morning about 105 or 106 down the list. Now, the question that was asked also in the Issues and Options paper late last year was, should priority be based on first in, first served, or should we have a different system for the way in which that works? So there's a few equity issues there around that, because it's also a proposal for looking at the way in which treaty claims and treaty settlements could be moved into that as well as we make the RMA treaty compliant. So some real equity issues around the way in which we allocate water. And first in, first served might not be perfect, but is it the fairest system? Some people in Auckland today might be saying, no, it's not. We need the water more than some of the others do.
Yeah, so therefore David Parker's environment priority first would see that water take of an over-allocated river would not be a priority.
Well, potentially, yes. So that's the issue that we have here at play, is that with the current Act, we've got a bit of a balancing act. You still can't grant a consent for an application that would have effects on the environment that are more than minor or that could be avoided, remedied or mitigated. And in the case of where you've got an over-allocation, actually a regional council generally can't even approve an application at all, because it would be prohibited because the resource is over-allocated. So there's a few different strands and layers to it, but ultimately what it comes down to is that we have to have that fundamental conversation before we get into the detail around, does the environment always come first, or is it a balancing act between all of the competing needs and the way in which we interact with our environment and the way in which we utilise the resource that we have and the way in which we look after it?
Okay, so what about the blanketing RMA process whereby it's so uneven in the different regions? And I'm thinking of the, inequitable situation that I experienced living in Auckland, watching that rainfall fall out of the sky with no storage whatsoever. Yet the pressures of the RMA on Central Otago's ability to have water take from one of the highest volumed rivers, the Clutha River, going past on the lowest rainfall region because of the fact of a blanket RMA. What changes could we see in that inequitable situation?
I think what that ultimately comes down to is that's where the policy does need to be science-led, and we need to think about what the allocation to the environment is, when it's appropriate to take, and that's broadly where regional councils come in. You've got the complicating factor in Otago where you've got hydro schemes there and you've got different needs in terms of energy generation as well. So there's lots in that mix, but it's really important to ensure that we're setting those limits according to the catchments, but also considering some of those wider community conversations. And so if you have an environment first, you would see something, Otago probably not a good example with the hydro scheme, but you would see something where the waterway comes first. And a lot of people would say that is ultimately where we should be. How you tick that through and what the impact of that might be in terms of the ability for people to have water for drinking, to interact with it in a recreational sense, and also thinking about what lives in those rivers as well. So it's really complex, but ultimately, if I take it back to where we were before, we need to have a really broad conversation as a nation about what our values in this space are. And at the moment, that conversation's not happening as these RMA reforms are going through, which is the crucial time to have them. Otherwise, change before we've had the conversation ourselves as a society.
But Megan, sometimes the government believe that they need to come in swinging with that stick because some regional councils are getting on with it and others aren't. And if it isn't up to them, then it wouldn't get done. What's your thoughts on that?
That is a fair criticism, and I think that there's a fair criticism of the RMA and that it hasn't worked in the way that it was anticipated, and people from both sides of the fence, if we have a side of the fence around pro-development or pro-environment, are equally as disappointed in the way that the RMA has worked. We have to remember that the RMA delegates authority to different parts of the planning frameworks. You've got national policy statements we've heard a lot about lately, national environmental standards, but we didn't have any of those until the late 2000s, and the RMA came in the early 90s. So we've never actually seen the RMA work in the way that it was intended. So I think it's somewhat unfair to criticise the legislation itself before we think about the implementation and the way that falls through. Yes, there are councils all over the country that have done a really poor job. ECan was one of them until just recently, and that's why the commissioners were brought in. And I think we will see a bit more of a focus on ensuring that regional councils are doing our jobs. And it's really, really important that we do, because ultimately this is about providing good outcomes for the environment and good outcomes for communities. But we need to have that national direction set in place so we know where to go.
What about funding from government to allow regional councils to be able to see out the regulatory requirements and framework that's put on them?
This is a topic quite dear to my heart, Sarah. We've had our annual plan discussions and long-term plan discussions are continuing at the moment. So we're looking at rates rises and looking at the way in which regional councils are funded. Now, some regional councils have big assets like ports and things, and others like us don't. We are constantly having more and more legislation and requirements put on us, but there's no additional funding for the way for how we might implement those. So ultimately for us here in Canterbury, that means we've got to fund that out of rates. We've been fortunate, we've been quite efficient, but we are still looking at rates rises. And if we continue to have increased responsibility, someone's got to pay for that. And I think it is time that we have a conversation around local government funding and the way in which that works and whether it is fit for purpose given the amount of delegated authority central government's handing down to local government.
And while I've got you there on the Action for Healthy Waterways policy, Megan, funding to go into the auditable farm environment plans as well. Do you believe that there's going to be funding to that, or is it going to be pushed on the responsibility of regional councils as well to see out this national policy direction?
At this point in time, it's anyone's guess. I haven't seen anything that would suggest there would be significant amounts of funding coming in to deliver some of these programs. I'll gladly welcome it if it's to come our way. But I think what we'll likely see is more of a focus on some of those biodiversity projects. We've already seen some of that, and also some of those biosecurity projects in the COVID recovery around the likes of the wild. Some really good news here in Canterbury to receive some of that funding from MFE and MPI to continue with wilding pine control in the Mackenzie Basin. So I'm really excited about that, and I think that's a great place to put that money.
I just want to close. Also, you would have picked up there Matthew Dolan, the New Zealand plant producers CEO, very happy about the amount of money being poured into native tree planting. As an ECan regional councillor, will you be inviting a lot more focus on this, not only from sequestering carbon, but from the biodiversity impacts as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So one part of the annual plan that came out last week, and that was codified by council last week, was a look at a planting and regeneration program. And so I'm excited to see where that might go as well. If we can partner up with government for funding and partner with those nurseries to get some more biodiversity all over our region, that can only be a good thing as long as we're putting the right trees in the right places.
Great way to end. Thank you so much, Megan Hands, ECan Councillor, there to close us out on Sarah's Country for another show. So now, if you're first-time viewer, first-time caller, I'd love you to be a first-time caller into the show. That is, of course, commenting in the comments below. We're going to do this all again tomorrow night, live from 7 o'clock across 15 different platforms. If you have been watching live, thank you for joining us. If you are an avid podcast listener, thank you so much as well. You can always get in touch with me, sarah@periummedia.com. I love your emails, as well as, of course, you can drop into the DMs on social media at any time to suggest any guests for the show, any issues that you want us to cover, and get, of course, behind those headlines, because that's what we do here on Sarah's Country, the matters that matter most. Now, I'd like to close on a point after we talked to Paul Rangiwahia there with his fantastic painting for mental health. The quote that you all need to remember: grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Good night and go well, and we'll see you tomorrow.
This is Sarah's Country.